Ya. Oye, bueno, muy buenos días a todas y todos. Gracias por sumarse a esta nueva conferencia organizada por la Facultad de Ingeniería y Ciencias de los Diálogos Transdisciplinarios sobre Sostenibilidad, que ha liderado nuestro profesor Daniel Olivares, que dirige la carrera de Ingeniería Civil en Energía. Y este tipo de espacios, tanto los espacios físicos que hemos tenido, como los virtuales, como estamos teniendo hoy día, han sido espacios excepcionalmente atractivos para poner en concreto uno de los pilares centrales que nosotros hemos planteado como la estrategia de cómo la ingeniería y las ciencias pueden contribuir desde la ciencia, la tecnología y la innovación hacia construir mayor bienestar para hoy, pero también para el largo plazo, combinando un desarrollo inteligente y sostenible. Inteligente significa inteligencia artificial, ciencia de datos, la productividad, pero que tiene que estar en balance con la sostenibilidad, cómo generar un impacto positivo en lo ambiental, en lo social, en lo económico, cómo poder ser más resilientes frente a los diversos desafíos de las transiciones que vivimos, y eso en particular con un énfasis en la mirada colaborativa e interdisciplinaria. Y por eso hemos tenido este tipo de seminarios. Precisamente nuestra Facultad de Ingeniería y Ciencias, con más de 120 académicos, en 12 grupos disciplinares diversos. Funcionamos muy de manera colaborativa internamente, no teniendo departamento y también colaborando con otras facultades de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, como otras instituciones, y por lo tanto la presencia hoy día de Rob precisamente marca ese tipo de esfuerzo que nosotros buscamos hacer, tener una mirada de un mundo más complejo donde los desafíos de transiciones y sostenibilidad son centrales. Entonces, quería agradecer la participación de Rob Dunn hoy día con nosotros. Y Daniel Olivares va a presentarnos más el contexto específico de esta charla. Así que muchas gracias, Daniel, por invitarnos y convocarnos y por tener la oportunidad de escuchar a Rob.
Bien, muchas gracias Claudio también por acompañarnos y por tus palabras. Como tú mencionabas, este seminario forma parte del ciclo de diálogos transdisciplinarios sobre sostenibilidad, que es una iniciativa conjunta entre nuestro Centro de Transición Energética, Centra de la UAI, nuestro programa de Ingeniería Civil en Energía, nuestro magíster en Tecnologías y Gestión de Energías Renovables y la Dirección de Investigación Institucional de la universidad. Les recuerdo que el objetivo de este ciclo ha sido abrir espacios de conversación donde distintas disciplinas se encuentren para reflexionar juntos sobre desafíos de sostenibilidad, vinculación entre ciencia, tecnología, política pública y también nuestras propias preguntas sobre los futuros que deseamos construir como sociedad. En este marco es un honor para mí presentar a nuestro invitado del día de hoy, Rob Dunn, quien es Senior Vice Provost for University Interdisciplinary Programs y William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor de North Carolina State University. Rob es un ecólogo reconocido internacionalmente, autor de 7 libros, incluidos A Natural History of the Future y su más reciente, The Call of the Honey Guide. Es un gran divulgador que combina ciencia rigurosa con una capacidad única para inspirar a públicos diversos. Así que, sin más que agregar, los dejo a todos con Rob Dunn. Rob, adelante.
Muchísimas gracias, Daniel, y gracias, Claudio. Ay, disculpe que daré esta charla en inglés, pero empezamos. I wear two hats, and I'm going to talk today from the context of both hats. And so one of those hats is as an ecologist, and I think about humans and other species, and the other is as a senior vice provost. And in my senior vice provost role, I think about how to bring people together from across our entire campus to solve practical problems in the world. And those can be any sort of problems. And the frame for today's talk is this word mutualism, which when I started working on it, I thought was a word that everybody knew, and it's become clear as the more I talk about mutualisms, the less obvious they are to people. But mutualisms are relationships between individuals of two or more species when both or all benefit. And so if two individuals in the same species partner and both benefit, that's cooperation. That's humans working with humans. A mutualism is a human working with a human gut microbe. It's a fish working with another fish. And a lot of my career has been about mutualisms. And recently I've been writing more about them. And so today in my talk, I'm going to draw on a recent book called The Honey Guide, which actually came out yesterday, and the scholarship in that book that focuses on human mutualisms. I'll also draw on The Natural History of the Future, which is an earlier book. And then I'm going to draw on my role in the Office of University Interdisciplinary Programs, all while thinking about mutualisms. In that latter role, I sit over our key interdisciplinary units on campus, so our Data Science and AI Academy, our Genetics and Genomics Academy, our Climate and Sustainability Academy, and our Integrative Sciences Initiative, which is focused on molecular innovation, our Plant Sciences Initiative. And these are all things that don't fit in a college. And so in doing that work, I'm always looking for those things that are so important we can't avoid doing them, but that transcend all of our units. And so require engineers, require crop scientists, require historians. And I think mutualisms is one of these things. Going to very quickly go through 6 sections of this talk. And what I hope is that this talk is sort of a first conversation that opens many doors for future conversations with many of y'all on this call today. The first section begins with one of the things that's become more apparent to me as I've worked more and more with people who aren't ecologists. And it's the recognition that very recently, as recently as 1,000 years ago, essentially all humans knew the environment in which they lived, they knew the species that they lived with, and they relied on those conditions to shape their life ways. And so if you lived in a flooded environment, you built houses on stilts, it didn't matter where you lived, and you invariably could name the species around you. And so in my experience working in the Amazon, there are many parts of the Amazon where the average 15-year-old kid can name 40 kinds of ants and can name hundreds or even more kinds of insects in general and name their uses and name their ways of relating to them. But what we've seen through time is that in North America and Europe and Chile and much of the world, people have moved into more and more urban lives and have distanced themselves from that kind of knowledge. And so there's this transition towards separateness that has deep roots in our conception of how we live and what the future looks like. And it's a future that was imagined sometimes as farce, sometimes as real imagining, but it's the future we've built, a future in which nature is outside and we're inside. And it's a future that even in states and regions like North Carolina that are actually pretty rural, is complete in the sense that a child growing up in Western North Carolina in a very rural town no longer knows the mammals or birds that live nearby, can no longer name the trees, even though as recently as 50 years ago, their parents could, their grandparents could. And so we have this kind of disconnection that I think is problematic and precise lockstep with the extent to which we still depend upon all of these species for any kind of sustainable future. And so take home one, we're increasingly unaware of the rest of life and our relationship with the rest of life. And this is accelerating the more virtual we become. The second section deals with our increasingly urban disconnected days and the reality that we make many false assumptions about the rest of life, which given our own smallness, we can just call life. And so in our ignorance, we assume knowingness, lifelessness, control, independence in a living world without agency. And we teach our students these things. We teach our engineering students that you can control most things. And as a biologist, my observation through my career is that that's less often true than we think. And so the first dimension of this is knowingness. This biologist is Terry Irwin. Early in his career, he was focused on ground beetles, carabid beetles, which by quirk of nomenclature live almost exclusively in tropical rainforest canopies. And he figured out that he could fog trees and the beetles would fall down. And when he did, he started to see more and more beetle species. And that eventually led him to try to estimate how many kinds of beetles there were. It led him to estimate how many kinds of arthropods there were. And he thought maybe there were 30 million arthropod species on Earth, which given that fewer than 1 million were named meant that most animals were not yet named. I was a grad student when this was becoming popularized, and it really shook my world. It meant that most of life was not named. This made its way into poetry. The poet writer Jim Harrison wrote, "Sitting on a stump, I feel a little closer to the idea that I'm a member of just one of possibly 30 million species." And then people debated a little bit what that number should be. The consensus now is maybe it's 7 million, not 30 million. But the point is, even if you just think about animals, 80% of animal species are not discovered. And then recently, people have focused more on microbes. And this paper by Ken Losey and Jay Lennon estimate that there might be 1 trillion species of microbes, which even, if it's off by some zeros, by a zero, 3 zeros gets us 1 billion. There are 30,000 microbe species named. And so the unknown is pretty vast. The second assumption is we tend to think life is fragile, and my sense from my work is that life is often far more tolerant of extremes than is humanity. And we've seen this as we've studied the biology of cities. And so this is Manhattan in New York, tipped on its end. The green is the green part of Manhattan. And we started to study those green spaces and then got really interested in what was happening in the gray spaces, in those spaces where we intentionally tried to kill all of life. And so we went into places, we had entomologists go into houses and look for insects. We took dust samples and used genetic decoding sequencing to identify which microbes were present. And this slide shows that probably 100 papers we wrote, summarized by one slide. We found thousands of plant species indoors, 40,000 fungal species, 2,000 arthropod species, now probably upwards of 200,000 bacterial species. We never got around to protists. And all of this is inside in the spaces where we're trying to kill everything. And the other thing we found is that the more extreme the habitat in the house, the more interesting life forms we found. And so hot water heaters, these very engineered habitats, have microbes that are only known from hot springs and hot water heaters. They become crucial commercially, those microbes, and they're living there, and we have no idea how they get there. Refrigerators and freezers have Arctic species that are quite interesting. And never in all this work have we found lifelessness, despite our actions. There's no sign that when we try to kill nature, we create the end of living nature. What we do instead is to create the end of the living nature that we want to be around. And, in fact, the worst of our assaults nonetheless favor some species. But again, not the species we typically want, but species that are favored. And so how do we think about this? It's a complex conversation we don't often have. The third assumption is that we're in control. And this is the assumption implicit in ideas like this for, I guess this is a Martian habitat, but, an off-Earth habitat, human dwellings tend to assume we're in full control. And as we've looked at buildings, we think of buildings as being in places we're in full control. This figure is one demonstration of the ways in which that's not true. The x-axis here is one dimension of difference. The y-axis is another dimension of difference. Points are closer together if their bacteria species are more similar. And so these 2 points, if you can see my cursor, are essentially identical bacteria. And they're color-coded by where the samples were taken. And so these are door trim samples where you have a lot of earth, soil-associated microbes. These are kitchen samples where you have a lot of food-associated microbes. This is somebody's TV that had a hot dog or something on it. Imagine somebody getting mad. And this is the thing that nobody likes, is that we can't microbially tell toilet seats and pillowcases apart. And so there's a lot here, but for me, one of the key conclusions is that we imagine that we're controlling life in a really nuanced way in our houses. And in fact, more or less what it is it's just where we put our bodies, where we open the windows, where we leave our food. And so even at this point, when we feel very fancy as humans, we're quite humble. The other thing we see is a big impact on what lives in houses is just who lives there. We can tell the ratio of men to women in a dwelling on the basis of armpit, men, to vaginal microbes, women. And so it's who's there, what are they doing, not fine control. The biggest impact is whether or not people have a dog in their house. Dogs bring all kinds of microbes in their houses. All of these things are more common when dogs are present. And they don't seem, some seem good, some seem bad, but the point again, not fine control. And then the other thing we've seen is if you look at bodily pathogens, if we compare the nest of chimpanzees and the houses of modern humans, or the modernized houses of Western humans, what we see is that Western houses have more pathogens than do chimp nests. And so chimps have lives with more healthful species around them than do we, at least some subsets of humans. And then the other thing we're able to do is to compare houses to the International Space Station. The International Space Station is where we have the most control, and microbially, it looks like a toilet seat. And so as we contemplate the future, we tend to assume we're in charge, and that if we have a good enough plan, that the living world will obey. And then we should instead imagine ourselves to be doing a kind of surgery on the living world while wearing boxing gloves. The exception is fermented foods, where we actually have a lot of control. And if there's a little time later, I can talk about fermentation, ants, yogurt, and some other related things. And so, second big take home, life is far more diverse, resilient, and in charge than we tend to imagine. And now I'm going to segue to the nature of our mutual interdependence and non-independence. And I think that we often imagine ourselves as humans, being this sort of top piece of a Calder sculpture, and that life is controlled by us and hangs from us. And my observation is that our actual relationship to the rest of life is often more like we're one of those pieces at the bottom of the sculpture. We're dependent. And I think about termite queens as a metaphor for this. And so what you see here, everybody can see that this body at the top, that's a termite queen swollen with eggs. She and all of the workers in the colony depend on microbes to digest their food. If they don't have the microbes, they don't survive. The microbes depend on the termites. If the microbes don't have the termites, most can't survive. So they're mutually interdependent. And for the termites, the way they make sure that they pass on these microbes is each time a queen flies, she carries them with her. And so the question then becomes, what are we interdependent upon, and what should we carry with us? And for me, that's a big question for the framing of my life work. And then the other thing that's true of these termites is often the microbes they have host other microbes. And so this is an amazing protist that lives in some termites. And those, what look like flagella or cilia on this protist are actually spirochete bacteria. And so the termites depend on this protist. The protist depends on the termite. And then the way that the protist moves is that the spirochetes that live on it move it on its behalf. And so these levels of interdependence are often complex and require a kind of vertical inheritance. And so now I want to quickly segue, and I'll do this fast so we have some time for conversation, into some of the forms of interdependence we have. And so I've thought a lot about and worked a lot about the evolution of our interdependence with the microbes that live on our bodies, in our guts, in our armpits, and how they've evolved. And suffice it to say that those relationships are so intimate that it's impossible to say where your microbes end and where your body begins, that you're a collective. That dependence is complete. We've worked a lot on this. One of the things that we see is that at least historically, it's very likely that our ancestors acquired their microbes much as termites acquire theirs. That's been disrupted. We're seeing all kinds of problems as a result of that disruption. We no longer have the same kind of vertical inheritance we once did during vaginal birth and breastfeeding. And what does that look like for the future? Lots of open questions there. These health problems all in some way relate to our failure to acquire the microbes we once all acquired. The second oldest of our mutualisms is with trees. And so for many millions of years, our ancestors lived like chimpanzees in trees, and they depended heavily on fig trees. They ate the fig fruit. they digested the fig, but they deposited in their feces the seeds of the figs. And so the forest marched across the savanna, one feces at a time. And so the fig depended on the chimpanzees, it depended on our ancestors. In the same way, our ancestors depended on the fig for food, but our ancestors also depended on the fig for housing. The fig tree was home. The fig fruit was food. And so that's an ancient one of our mutualisms that we still have versions of. And then again, I could talk for a long time about how our relationships with trees has changed, but it has persistent elements that we now study in the context of studies of chimps, but also humans around the world. And that's transitioned. Our relationship to plants now includes many grasses and agriculture and a big altered version, but we never stopped needing trees. But the scale has shifted. And so there's lots of great economic work now showing the benefits of trees to humans, but it's no longer the tree that lives in your yard, it's the collective of trees. And even then, the total tree cover declines year over year. There's a footnote here that there's a temptation when we think about these mutualisms to think about nature as being all peaceful and that these are wonderful partnerships that are simple. Very often, the species that are our partners are not the partners of other species. And so, for example, trees, which we love, we benefit from, they're trees because of brutal competition. The only reason they make trunks is to grow above other plants and kill them so that they can get the sunlight. And so, really trees are assholes, but they're sort of ours, right? We partner with them, we benefit from them, but it's important to recognize that each one of these relationships has many dimensions. And then the other kind of relationship, as I started to consider human mutualisms, that became really clear was very common historically and prehistorically, maybe less now, is copredation. And this is the titular species of the Call of the Honey Guide book. This is a honey guide bird. It has the problem that it eats wax and only wax, but it can't get into beehives on its own. And so what it does is it evolved the ability to go to human settlements, make a specific call, and say to the humans, for the love of God, if you just follow me to the honeybee hive and crack the hive open, you can have all the honey. I want the wax. And no fewer than a dozen and probably many more human cultures responded. And this is a very ancient mutualism that's been, and this is the distribution of the bird. The relationship's been known by traditional peoples across Africa for a very long time. But scientists have started to document that story and to show that traditional peoples understand a great deal about this relationship. And in each place, the humans make a specific call with which they respond to the honey guide. The culture of the relationship is local in scale, even as the geography of the birds and humans is wider. And there are versions of other relationships like this that are much more common than once thought. In multiple places, including Brazil, humans have partnered with dolphins, where the dolphins come and call to the humans and say, we are rounding up fish. Get ready with your nets. The humans throw the nets. The dolphins pick the fish off the nets. This has evolved at least 4 times. It's well documented. It's a relationship with individual populations of individual subspecies of individual dolphins. And then the most fantastic version of this is a relationship that was documented until relatively recently in southeastern Australia among the Tua mob, who lived as whalers and lived in the town of Eden. And killer whales would trap baleen whales like a humpback whale. And then one killer whale would go to the town of Eden to recruit the human whalers who would then go kill the baleen whale. And the human whalers would leave the tongue for the killer whales and take the rest back. Stephen Holmes, a Tua traditional custodian of stories, said of this, we consider the Bewas, the killer whales, to be our brothers. Our Dreamtime stories, which connect us to the Bewas, is that when a Tua member dies, they're reincarnated as the Bewa. The Bewas remained part of the Tua even after passing. The Bewas would help the men by herding the other whales in the Bay of Turambullur for the whalers to kill. Aboriginals would give the Bewas the tongue of the dead whale. This was soon known as the law of the tongue. Very well documented. Just this extraordinary partnership. And then our current thinking is that our relationships with dogs emerge in a similar context. This is what you get when you Google American with wolves. We're a weird place. And that it eventually evolves into the relationships we think about today. I'm going to very briefly flip through some other kinds of relationships that I think about at much greater depth in the book, but I'm also glad to talk about more. I work a lot on our relationship with yeasts. And what we see with yeasts is that they too probably called to our ancestors. And so imagine a fruit on the forest floor. If the fruit was covered in filamentous fungi, it was dangerous. If it was covered in yeasts and lactic acid bacteria, it was almost certainly safe. And we now see evidence that non-human primates appear to control fermentation. There's some evidence in capuchin monkeys, for example. It's almost certainly the case that for millions of years, our ancestors were controlling fermentation in some ways. And in other ways, it's fair to say that the yeasts and the lactic acid bacteria were controlling them. They were calling to them. This too was a mutualism. This too was a relationship in which both sides had some agency. And one of the things we see is if we look at human bodies, we see evidence of this relationship. And so about 8 million years ago, apes evolved a version of alcohol dehydrogenase that supersizes their ability to metabolize alcohol. Doing so is clearly a big advantage. And roughly contemporaneous, our ancestors evolved the lactate receptors in their tissues. Those receptors tell the immune system to calm down and tell the body to stop metabolizing fat when there's lactate. But both of these look to be responses to fermentation very early. And all of you have these versions. They're present in every modern human. And it also looks like from our own work that sour taste, the preference for sour foods evolves about the same time. Domestication is when species that's the domesticate is the one that responds evolutionarily to the mutualism. A pig growth form and behavior respond to humans. In the case of yeast and lactic acid bacteria, we changed much more than they did. And so you could say that in this long-term relationship with yeast and lactic acid bacteria, that once upon a time a yeast had the idea to control primates, and in doing so, reshaped the earth. As we continue through these kinds of relationships, we get relationships where the coming together of humans and other species results in something different. Symbiogenesis is when species come together to form a whole that's different from the sum of their parts. Cultural symbiogenesis is when humans and other species come together to form a cultural whole that's more than its parts and has its own tendencies. And so we can think about the partnership of humans with horses as an example case of this. We come together, we become a kind of a centaur, that has its own tendencies. I think it's interesting to think about the mythological dimensions of how people depict human-horse relationships. But I think it's also depicted in lines like this from Rebecca Solnit, who writes, "There's a Buddhist story about a man galloping by a monk who asks, 'Where are you going?' 'Ask my horse,' says the man." And increasingly work on human and horse relationships, and Peter Turchin's work's an example, suggests that when humans partnered with horses, they acquired collective traits that reshaped the world. And so Turchin argues that human societies that partnered with horses became more colonial and more warlike, and it was near inevitable. And that then was a collective trait. That appears true, but there are some exceptions. There was actually a separate domestication of horses in what's now Kazakhstan. And that one did not appear to be colonial or warlike, but the horses and the people, their genes all disappeared. And so we have these alternate histories we can think with, but they offer interesting complexities. But if we have these symbiogenetic tendencies, what if each species with which we might partner predisposes humans to particular futures, and those futures aren't preordained, but more likely, if that's the case, how might we think about our own futures? Which species do we want to partner with? And one of the things we see looking back in time is those moments in which we've most radically changed the species we partner with are times of climate change. And so we are again in a time of radical climate change. And so we are in a time in which we need to think about which species do we partner with to embark upon better futures. And is it species that we use in transgenic corn? Is it the Bt toxin from a microbe from a moth? What is it? How are we thinking about it? And so take home here, and I'm going to sort of wrap us into a big picture and then pause for questions, and I've got more if there's time. Humans engage or have engaged in many types of mutualisms, most of which were geographically and lineally local, but some of which have spanned vast temporal domains. Now, the reality check, and I see some comments in the chat that sort of presage some of this where I'm going here, is the question of what are our partnerships today? How do we think about the big picture? If we measure our collective dependency in terms of biodiversity and how many species we partner with, it's vast. Humans consume tens of thousands of species, each of which is dependent on tens or more of other species. And then we have many other kinds of relationships. And so just in the Svalbard seed bank, there are 1.3 million seed varieties. Most have host-associated microbes. Many are dependent on other mutualists, such as pollinators. This is an extraordinary network of dependence, unlike anything else that any other species has ever had. We are more wed to the rest of life than any other species ever. And that includes all of these things. It amuses me, for example, that the astronauts, when they go to space, they bring their feces back to Earth for Earth organisms to decompose. Even when we go out into space, we're still dependent on this web. And so as we think about the future, a termite, when it goes into the future, a queen carries with it her microbes. What do we need to be carrying with us into the next generations? And that's got to include both the species we depend on now, but also those we might depend on in the future. And my experience is this is as much an engineering question, a historian question, as it is a biologist question. The biologists on their own will always fail to answer this question. And so how do we think about it collectively? But the other reality is if we look at our collective dependency in terms of biomass, it really changes. And so this figure, this pie diagram shows the relative number of calories humans get from different crop species. And 6 to 8 species, depending on how you account for the vast majority of all calories that humans ingest. And so the vast majority of all carbon molecules in our bodies. And so we have this huge collective dependency, but some species matter disproportionately. And we can see this in other ways. This is a great paper by Greenspoon and colleagues, and this shows the relative biomass of mammals. And so look at that top panel for a second. That orangey color on the top, or maybe it's a red, that's the biomass of humans. This is before Ozempic and Wegovy, but I think it wouldn't change so much. The bottom is our mutualists, our domesticated species, that red. That blue at my right, that's the marine mammals. And that little green sliver on my left is all of the terrestrial wild mammals on Earth. And so if we think in terms of biomass, a very small number of species that we depend on have taken over essentially all of the mammalian biomass on Earth except that tiny sliver. And so I think this is hard to appreciate and hard to fully bring into our lives, but a pretty important reality. And then this has weird things. And so right now, dogs are equal in biomass to all wild mammals on Earth. And to me, this is such a weird reality that I put it 3 times. Like, how do we make sense of this? And then if we look at cats, they're a little bit less in biomass, but we've done work to look at their trophic level using stable isotopes. And because they eat so much tuna collectively, they're hyper predators. They're like hyenas of the ocean based on their diet. This is also a pretty weird dimension to our current dependencies. And at the same time, we're reducing tree cover that we know we depend on. And so take home four, we collectively depend on many species, and their dependence, and yet a small handful of species account for the vast majority of human calories in life. And so how do we choose our partnerships? Going alone is not an option. Which species do we partner with as we think about different kinds of futures? One thing to keep in mind is that most species we could partner with are microbial, and we take advantage today of a small minority, a rounding error of what is possible. But the other thing is to recognize we're going to need multiple answers. No one decides, and the other species will have a say in all of this, the other trillion or so species. Early in my career and early in writing books, I was often pushed to provide simple answers to conservation questions, to interdisciplinary questions. And the more I've gone through my career, the more I've realized that there are very few moments in decision making where one person gets to decide anything. Our biggest decisions are made by collectives. And so, how do we have the conversations where we work together to figure out what do we want? What future do we want? And how do we work with artists and visionaries to think about what futures are possible as it relates to other species? But it's also a more general point. And then what metrics do we use? I had the privilege to interview Christina Cook, who worked on the International Space Station for a long time. And one of the things that she said is that when she lived on the International Space Station, one of the favorite jobs for everyone was to water the plants, because when you water the plants, the smell of the soil, jessamum, the compound that comes out of the soil from the microbes in the soil when you water the soil reminded them of home, reminded them of earth. And clearly that's a benefit. But how do you measure that? What should we measure? Historically, the medical profession has thought about life expectancy. Evolutionary biologists think about fitness. We don't measure our own lives in that way anymore. Should it be disability adjusted life years? Is it human development index? Is it sustainability? Is it something else? Which of these are symmetrical? Do we ask the same things for our partners that we ask for ourselves? I guarantee that those listening right now don't agree on the answers to these, but we seldom even discuss the questions. And so how do we get to a point when we can? And so I'm going to stop here, conscious of the time. I have more and stranger things I can dip into, but I want to make sure we have a chance to talk. So I'll stop sharing screen for a second here.
Great. Thank you, Rob. This has been fantastic. I think we can make Jose, please help me here. Can we make the audience to be able to open their microphones and turn on the cameras?
Yes, they are allowed.
They're allowed. Okay. I see a couple of questions on the Q&A from Bernardo, but Bernardo, maybe if you are there, you can just ask them yourself. I see Josefina as well. Rodrigo, thank you for turning on the camera. Bernardo, there you go.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rob, for this nice presentation and very interesting topics. Yeah, my question was, let me see if I, yeah, it was about this, you mentioned this connection between microbes and our bodies. So what makes our humans special, maybe, I mean, what I think is the connection between these two species. So why are you thinking about how artificial intelligence could capture that special relation between bodies? I mean,
Yeah,
you
that's.
I don't know.
Sorry, Bernardo, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Maybe answered in two ways. I mean, one would be that I think our growing sense is that the microbial part of the body has much more influence on who you are and how you think and how your brain works than we used to think.
Mm.
I think it is still very early days. I distrust anyone that says that understand microbe human brain relationships. That said, we know from mice, if you change the microbes that a mouse has, it changes the mouse's behavior. And so it's something pretty fundamental there. Um, and And so to go to your question, what would it look like to think with artificial intelligence the ways that our brains plus our microbes think? And I think that's a fascinating area, and in general, I think the analogies and metaphors between artificial intelligence and brains and microbial organization and social insects, they were worked on a lot 20 years ago. And in the last 3 years, we kind of dropped them. But now we're trying to figure out what is AI now that we've made it. And I think it's a fruitful time to go back to these other systems because AI is way more like some termite societies than it is necessarily like our own brains. The other thing I'm very aware of, and it's one of the areas where I'm aware that I need other kinds of scholars to think, is that we attribute most of our thinking to our brains or our brains plus our microbes, but a lot of our decision making is subconscious. And so your immune system is making its decisions right now about the world. Your olfactory system is also making decisions about the world. And those decisions have a lot more features that are similar to AI. And we wouldn't know if those were also conscious, right? So it's possible that you have two consciousnesses working at the same time and they just don't know about each other. Uh, and so I think that weirdness of our biology is conducive to the thinking across disciplines. And I found that engineers are great for this because you're thinking with engineering and well, what's the metaphor that's germane? And how do we bring and you don't have to be wed to the way we used to think. Um, and I've worked with a lot of people who do biomimicry, and that started in ecology and evolutionary biology. I think it's largely moved into engineering because the engineers could operationalize that insight. And so I think in AI, that's also true. And so I won't. It's a great question, Bernardo, and there's huge opportunity there. I don't know if I answered it, but I talked about it for a little bit.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your answer.
Thank you. I know Josefina had a question as well. Please feel free to open your microphones as well if you have a question.
Thank you so much, Rob, for the talk. I'm interested in the example that you gave of cultural symbiogenesis, the horses and the humans. I was wondering if we have empirical data regarding the fitness of the horses in this in this partnership, because for the human it is obvious the benefits of the partnership, but I'm not sure if we have data for the horses compared to the wild ones.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it depends on spatial scale, and and time scale. And so if you look at an individual community and say, like one of these communities in Kazakhstan where horses are first encountering humans, um, one of the things that happens is that reproduction speeds up. And so I think there are arguments that could be made that in those moments, even that fitness increases, um, if measured the way evolutionary biologists measure it, right? The number of offspring per unit time. I've not seen anybody do it carefully, and I can imagine scenarios in which it goes both ways, and probably it varies geographically. But the other thing that people do is they start to move with horses. And once people move with horses, then you have whole new geographic areas where there weren't horses. And then the collective fitness goes way up because of that geographic spread. The, the other dimension, though, is that if you think about long enough time scales, in the Americas, there were multiple species of horses that, due to some mix of climate change and being delicious, disappear. And so the time scale, the spatial scale, they matter. And I think um, it's very tempting in these relationships to try to pigeonhole them into simple things. And for me as a biologist, the beauty is often how slippery they are. And so we use them to think rather than use them as answers. But it's a great question. I mean, I don't know, Safina, if you were thinking, what else were you thinking about this? Am I answering it, or are you?
Yeah, that's okay. I was wondering because we always have an anthropocentric vision of the cooperation, but so that lead us to think on cooperation or mutualism with a human-centered
Yeah.
vision.
I'll give two more examples, and please others raise your hand so I'm not foreshortening other questions. But one would be chickens, where from a number of offspring perspective, chickens are doing as well as they've ever done. If we could ask the chicken, no chicken is happy with the current state of that success. Um, but then also we're asking something other than fitness per se. And so the chickens become interesting in this. But the other would be yeast. And so yeasts have clearly done much better in partnering with us than we've done relative to them. We often suffer that partnership. You know, if you think about alcoholism, you think about other fitness consequences of alcohol. Uh, but the yeasts are always benefiting. And so I think on both sides that becomes interesting. When do we think they're benefiting and they're not, or they're benefiting in some very shallow way? Um, and when do we think we're in control and the key beneficiary, but in fact we're being tricked? Um, and yeah, I'll pivot to well the next question. But if there's time, let me come back to the eyebrows of dogs because they're also interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josefina.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Let me take you to a more sort of philosophical perspective because I must admit, after reading your book of the natural history of the future, I went very deep into Eastern and Western philosophy because of all the questions that it opened. And I also see that you reflect upon certain Buddhist histories on your presentation as well. But what I feel your books do is sort of point at this illusion of control and illusion of agency somehow, which is a topic that is being touched by old and modern philosophers all over the place. You can find that. Um, what I feel you're saying is that the decisions we make are loosely connected with what actually happens in the system when you go to micro scales, and maybe it's the same thing when you go to macro scales. Uh, so, uh, and I also feel that there are many artists that are trying to convey some of the same ideas, and I've also seen that you are trying to connect dots with artists as well. So I wonder if you have uh, already developed some methodologies to work together towards bringing these ideas, creating the new symbols to make sense of what these insights are trying to convey.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will resist the temptation to give it too simple of an answer, but I'll give some examples. Y- um, Over my career, one of the things I feel like I've seen more and more is that biologists are insufficient to give people the alternate futures that they should be talking about. And physicists too, and chemists and engineers, you know, we can say what's technically possible and what's biologically possible, but for me, it's the writers, it's the artists, it's the other creatives who can help us think about what are the whole worlds that might be possible. That include what are the machines, they include what's the biology, but they also include what's the culture. And and for me, it's a constant struggle to find the right ways to bring people together to get those futures. And um, you know, I think one of our collective failures is if you look at the climate scenarios, the you know the global climate scenarios for different levels of greenhouse gas emissions, they were made by wonderful physicists. And so there's a number, and that number has consequences, but they in no way relate to people's daily lives. And so if you're asking me to choose between, you know, 4.5 and 8.5, that doesn't relate emotionally to anything I live every day. And I wonder if we'd engaged artists 30 years ago to help us think about scenarios, if we wouldn't be in a better position. And so what we are trying to do, and we're trying 10 different ways, is to convene artists and scientists and engineers and humanities scholars to think about different futures, to think about disruptions of what we know. And we're not perfect at it. Sometimes it totally fails. But I would say one feature that helps is that it has to be in a disruptive context. If we do it in the same room in which we have a boring standard university meeting, it does not work because everybody goes into that room and thinks, okay, I know what to do. Someone will talk, I will ask a question, someone will take notes, and then we'll forget about the whole thing. And so if people are in that mindset, it's broken. And so you have to get people somewhere else. Or like several times we brought in opera singers into our leadership meetings. And so you start the meeting, everyone's sitting there, and then suddenly you're thrown into opera. And once you're thrown into opera, the room breaks, right? It's no longer the same room. And then you can have a different conversation. And so, how do you have earnest enough conversations that draw on philosophy and art and history that are appropriate, going back to one of Bernardo's questions, appropriate to the scale of challenge that we face? And so I don't have an answer, but for me, like that quest to figure out how do we get people together to do this, I feel like it's one of the most important things I can do.
And you're doing a great job, Rob. Thank you so much. Lots of interesting ideas. We would love to collaborate on that kind of disruptive context building because I feel we're trying to do the same here. And this series of seminars are part of that as well. We'll try to be more disruptive, though, according to your experience,
Do we have the
which
dean's
is
approval?
valuable.
Claudio, can we be more disruptive?
Oh, Claudio had to leave. He
Oh,
said,
all
"I'm
right.
sorry," but yeah, he'll approve. I
All
know
right.
him. He'll approve. So,
All right, great. Well,
okay.
thank you, everybody. And again, I regret that I couldn't be there in person, but it's a joy to think with you a little bit today.
Hopefully, you can join us in person the next time. Thank you so much, Rob, again, and I hope to see you again in the future. We will switch to another meeting now, Rob, for the podcast recording.
Gracias, que tengan buen día y buen futuro.
Muchas gracias. Igualmente. Adiós.
Um,
Gracias.
Thank
Thanks
you,
very
Raul.
much.